All right. Without further ado, thanks everyone for coming to this bonus extra GSI seminar of the academic year. This one really probably will be the last one of this academic year, but we're delighted to welcome Charlie Wilson visiting us from the University of East Anglia and the Tyndall Centre to speak about transforming energy demand to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees C. As we've lost a little bit of time now, I'm just going to hand it over to you, Charlie, without bigging you up anymore. But as you'll hear, Charlie has been doing some really great, innovative, cross and transdisciplinary work. Over to you, Charlie.
Great, thank you very much. And yeah, it's really nice to be here. I put together a talk which is a little bit unusual in that I want to try and give you a broad sense of different research projects and papers that I've been working on over the past few years, rather than sort of a more traditional kind of deep insight into one particular project. But I've sort of linked various bits of work around this narrative backbone of thinking about how we can think about transforming energy demand as well as energy supply in order to meet the Paris Climate Agreement targets. So I'm just signaling to Jean-Francois, who's very nicely doing the slides. JF, could you possibly also minimize the Zoom window just to get it off the screen? There we go. So I want to start with a provocation, which is that the 1,000+ scenarios in the IPCC's fifth assessment report and the 400-odd scenarios in the IPCC's 1.5 degree report in 2018 are biased in that they have a systematic tendency to explore only a part of the future possibility space when it comes to limiting global warming. So if you imagine this grey cloud as being all possible futures, so the only constraint is that they need to obey known physical laws. Within that cloud, mitigation scenarios tend to focus on the stuff in the orange bubble. So they tend to focus on energy supply transformation, on negative emission technologies, on cumulative and incremental pathways of change that rely on efficiency and continued growth of the economy in GDP terms. And obviously within that sort of orange bubble, the 1.5 degree scenarios are a very small subset that meet this very constrained carbon budget. Conversely, the stuff outside that orange bubble in the grey cloud, energy demand transformation, the potential of technologies which are currently commercially niche, but can act to transform energy demand, and also ideas of sufficiency, so living with less rather than trying to do more with less. Those types of futures are less explored. JF, next slide, please. So we see this in the IPCC's special report from a few years back. These three pathways were reference pathways or marker pathways showing how to reach 1.5 degrees. The grey declining wedge is CO2 from fossil fuels. The brown is CO2 from land use. And the yellow is the negative emission wedge. And the P3 scenario, that one in the middle, is really the sort of central kind of reference case, if you like, in the IPCC setup. Next slide, please. So I want to talk about this other stuff that's outside this normal scenario analysis related to demand side transformation. And I want to make, well, here are 5 assertions that I want to make, each of which I'll then back up with evidence that I'll show you. So the first is that demand side technologies and innovation can change rapidly. Diffusion can happen rapidly. The second is that it can make a big dent on emissions. And the third is that diffusion processes are fundamentally social. They work through processes of social influence. Those 3 assertions I'm going to give you empirical evidence from empirical research that I've been involved in. And then the final 2 are work that I've been involved in terms of simulation modeling and scenario analysis. So that social influence and technological learning interact to create a positive feedback which accelerates change. And that if you put all these things together, you can see clear potential for demand side transformation to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. Next slide, please. So, okay, the first assertion, demand side technologies can diffuse rapidly. Next slide, please. So I want to introduce you to a very simple binary distinction between what we call granular technologies and lumpy technologies. So granularity refers to technologies or innovations with a relatively small unit size, low unit cost, and modularity. So they scale by replication. So if you look at the examples on the left, they're energy supply. So solar PV is the canonical example. And if you look on the right, they are demand side technologies. So here's an example of e-bikes. At the bottom, you see the alternative, the lumpy technologies and infrastructures, large unit sizes, high unit costs, and non-divisibility. So these tend to scale by getting bigger, by upscaling. So again, the kind of canonical example in the energy supply is the nuclear power plant. And in end use or demand side terms, we're thinking about things like the giant jet aircraft. Next slide, please. So we worked for over a number of years collecting data on about 100 different energy technologies historically in terms of their historical performance. And we assessed them against various criteria in terms of their granularity. So this plot is showing along the x-axis is a measure of granularity, so unit cost. So the low unit cost technologies on the left and the lumpy technologies on the right. The y-axis is showing a measure of diffusion timescales, the delta T. So the delta T is a commonly used measure for how long it takes a technology to move from niche to mainstream markets. And so essentially longer delta T's, that diffusion process takes longer. So you can see each of these points is a historical energy technology. And although there's a lot of scatter, which you'd expect because lots of things determine how quickly technologies diffuse, there's also a statistically significant upwards trend. In other words, more granular technologies have shorter diffusion timescales. In other words, they deploy more rapidly. Next slide, please. So just to give some examples of some of these data points, on the granular left-hand side, you've got energy efficient light bulbs, next generation light bulbs, and also a range of domestic appliances. And on the right-hand side, the lumpy side, you've got big infrastructure like gas pipelines or refineries. So more granular energy technologies deploy faster, and this is partly because they have lower risk. Next slide, please. We also looked at something called the learning, conventional learning, or the learning rate. So learning, technological learning, is the process by which experimentation, trial, testing, and use of technologies leads to improvements in cost and performance. And a common metric of learning is the learning rate. This is the percentage reduction in cost for every doubling of experience with a technology. So in this plot, you can see the more granular technologies on the left have higher learning rates than the lumpy technologies on the right. Next slide, please. So again, the kind of classic example of rapid learning is the microchip and all the sort of digital applications that spin from that. And on the right-hand side, the lumpy technologies, which actually have negative learning rates, include things like flue gas desulfurization for stripping sulfur emissions out of fossil fuel combustion, and again, the nuclear power plants. So here we see granular technologies learn faster in cost and performance. Next slide, please. So a third characteristic we looked at are the social returns on public innovation investments. So if you invest, this was actually from US Department of Energy data. So if you invest $1 in public R&D, how much do you get back in terms of social returns? And here you can see that the benefit cost ratios, the benefit cost ratios are much higher for granular technologies. Next slide, please. With the most favorable example in the DOE's, the Department of Energy's portfolio being lighting ballasts in fluorescent lighting. And the worst performing example in their portfolio was the lumpy gas turbine. So many examples of these granular technologies, many of which, not all of which, but many of which are on the demand side of the energy system. Next slide, please. Okay, so the second proposition I wanted to make is that these kinds of demand side innovations can help reduce emissions. Next slide, please. So in recent work, we've been looking at a whole range of consumer innovations, many of which are digital, and which in different ways can challenge mainstream consumption practices and mainstream norms. So if you think about mobility, the dominant norm by far is us driving our fossil-fueled cars, often with low occupancy. And here we see digital innovations and other business model innovations creating a variety of shared mobility options, as well as obviously electric vehicles and e-bikes on the right. Next slide, please. If you think about food provisioning, the dominant norms would be doing big supermarket food shops with over-provisioning leading to waste. And here we see innovations like online food hubs, which are equivalent to digital farmers markets. We see meal kits or recipe boxes, which offer essentially zero waste food provisioning. And then apps, for example, for connecting surplus food producers with consumers to avoid waste. Next slide, please. And if you think about using energy in homes, which I've sort of classified the mainstream norm as using energy kind of however and whenever we need it or want it, and this energy is supplied centrally. We have a range of smart technologies in the home which can help better integrate our energy use patterns into those of the grid. And if you look at the yellow app icons on the bottom right, you'll see a variety, again, of innovations which are transforming potential roles of us as households into households which store energy, which trade energy, and which provide storage resources back to network operators. So lots and lots of activity here in the consumer space, all of which challenge mainstream norms. But can this lead to emission reductions? Next slide, please. So this is some work we did, again, scouring the literature for evidence of the emissions impact of these consumer innovations. This is just a little section of one of the summary plots for 3 of the mobility innovations. Here we're seeing car sharing, ride sharing, and shared ride hailing. And you can see each of the lines in the plot is a study with a quantitative estimate, which we've compiled and standardized. And you can see that although there's some scatter, some uncertainties, all of these estimates fall to the left hand of that 0% vertical axis. In other words, innovation adoption leads to a reduction either in the amount of activity, so for example, the passenger kilometers traveled, or in the amount of energy or carbon emissions. Next slide, please. And here's an equivalent graph for some of the domestic or homes innovations, the smart technologies, and also HEMS, home energy management systems, which are particularly useful if you're a domestic energy producer and storer as well as consumer. They help essentially manage your internal electricity flows. So again, we see some uncertainties, some scatter, but the majority of the estimates of the consequences of using these innovations is that they help reduce activity, energy, or emissions. Next slide, please. Thinking a bit more sort of prospectively, think a bit more sort of longer term, you can imagine the technology on the left, the smartphone, which provides us kind of access through this portal through to a wide range of digital services, substituting for all of the single purpose analog devices on the right. Now, if that substitution were to happen completely, the savings in terms of energy use, in terms of embodied energy, which is the energy that goes into manufacture, and also in terms of the materials used in the products, would all be enormous. So these are represented by the size of the circles underneath the graphic on the left and the right-hand side. So if digital services substitute fully for the kind of ownership, product ownership model in consumer culture, potential benefits for energy and materials are very, very substantial. Next slide, please. So the third thing I want to talk about, different research that I've been involved with, is the importance of social dynamics for supporting the diffusion and adoption of these kinds of demand-side innovations. Next slide, please. So I've reproduced these app icons along the bottom of the screen because this project looked at, in this case, these 13 different consumer innovations across mobility, food, and homes. And we were particularly interested in the role of social influence. So social influence simply being interpersonal exchange of information about the benefits and risks of using an innovation. And the four main types of social influence mechanisms are word of mouth, as it sounds, electronic word of mouth, which is the digital version, so via social media, peer review sites, blogs, etc. Neighborhood effects or peer effects, which are come from being able to physically observe activity in your local area. And then more broad social norms. So what we consider to be both normal and also approved of in a wider social context. Next slide, please. So we did some large-scale survey work at the end of 2019, both in the UK and also in Canada, where we measured the strength of these social influence effects in different samples. So we measured a whole bunch of people who had adopted one or more of the innovations shown at the bottom, and then a whole bunch of people who hadn't, but who either had a high propensity or a low propensity to adopt them in the future. Next slide, please. And we found, consistent with theory on diffusion, that these social influence mechanisms right across the board were significantly stronger in the adopters than they were in the non-adopters, and so on down the chain as propensity to adopt decreased. So this isn't you can't infer causality from this. But there's a very strong association between strength of social influence and innovation adoption. Next slide, please. So we went a step further and we tested this by building simple statistical models, so logit models, which predict either adoption or non-adoption. And again, just to emphasize that in our survey data, we strategically sampled early adopters of each of these innovations so that we could compare their responses against what non-adopters told us, which gives us some robustness in our inferences. So in this plot, I'm showing three different variables that we constructed from our survey data. One on the intensity of social media use, so as a measure of electronic word of mouth, both how many digital platforms people used and also how often and intensely. The second one is the social influence one that I showed you before, comprising those four different mechanisms. And the third one, domain innovativeness, is a measure of how much people shape and inform opinion in their social networks. And what the bars in these plots are showing you is whether those variables were statistically significant predictors of adoption in each of the innovations shown along the bottom. And you can see that pretty much across the board, really consistently and with strong statistical significance, all these social influence aspects predict adoption as opposed to non-adoption. So adoption, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that shapes innovation adoption. And I think in the kind of climate world, we tend to focus a lot on policy and regulation. And the point of this research is to show that there are very important social dynamics which also support innovation diffusion. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to quickly pause while I go and grab my water from my, oh, sorry, I've just noticed my drink behind me. Apologies. Okay, so those were three examples of different empirical research projects that I've been involved with to try and understand different aspects of the potential for demand-side transformation. So now I want to give a couple of examples of work I've done collaborating with modeling groups to try and roll this empirical insights into analysis of climate mitigation. Next slide, please. So the first example is coming back to this idea of social influence. And we were particularly interested in the effect of social influence on electric vehicle adoption. So we started by going to the literature and we identified about 80 different studies which had looked at the effect of social influence on alternative fuel vehicle choice, so electric vehicles and so on. And from those 80, we found 21 that had comparable quantitative estimates of the strength of social influence on vehicle choice. And that's shown in this plot. Each horizontal bar is an estimate of the social influence effect on vehicle choice. And the blue the blue vertical line is the result of a meta-analysis to find, if you like, a mean or average effect size across those different studies. So this was our sort of quantitative estimate of the effect of social influence. Next slide, please. Now, we could also exploit variation in the sample of studies to look at how social influence varied as a function of culture. You'd expect a socially embedded process to be culturally sensitive. So in this plot, along the x-axis, you see a variety of countries from Taiwan on the left to Iran on the right. And the red columns is the size of the social influence effect in those countries based on that empirical work. So weakest in Taiwan, strongest in Iran. The blue line shows how that country's culture scores on a bipolar scale between what's called a normative culture and a pragmatic culture. So normative cultures are ones where, for example, there's a greater respect for tradition, status quo, there's a big emphasis on family. And pragmatic cultures are ones which essentially are more sort of adaptive to changing social and technological contexts. And you can see that there's an inverse correlation between the size of the social influence effect and this pragmatism score, meaning essentially that social influence effects are stronger in more normative cultures. And there's good data from something called the World Values Survey, which quantifies or classifies countries in terms of their normative culture. Next slide, please. So we could use this to take our social influence effects, vary it as a function of regions and cultures around the world, and then parameterize it alongside technological learning in a global simulation modeling framework. So this was the image model, which is an integrated assessment model run by the Dutch Environmental Assessment Agency. And it's very standard in those models that they'll introduce technological learning, which, if you remember, is the improvements in cost and performance as you gain experience with the technology. So the graph on the left shows a kind of a classic model simulation of the uptake of battery electric vehicles, or BEVs, under assumptions of technological learning and climate policy, the carbon tax. On the right, you see what happens if you include social learning as well alongside technological learning. You get this positive feedback whereby adoption of electric vehicles helps drive down cost and performance, which leads to further adoption, which leads to more social influence effects from adopters to non-adopters, which leads to further adoption, and so on. So we think that these outcomes on the right are both more behaviorally realistic, as well as being more behaviorally realistic and telling a more complete story about the potential for, in this case, the EV transition. Next slide, please. So finally, kind of putting all this together, this various bits of empirical and modeling work that I've been showing you, we looked at the overall global potential for demand-side transformation. Next slide, please. So coming back to this sort of where I began by making the case that the scenarios in the IPCC and other contexts have a systematic tendency not to explore demand-side transformation. Next slide, please. We deliberately designed this scenario study to focus on some of these things on the right-hand side. So looking at commercially niche end-use technologies and very dramatic changes over the next 20, 30 years. Next slide, please. So what we did is, this was called the Global Low Energy Demand, or LED scenario. And we spent a lot of time trying to develop a really cogent and consistent narrative of change from 2020 to 2050. So this is captured in this kind of wheel image, where the outer blue circle are the sort of big picture megatrends driving change in this scenario, many of which I've talked about. So these new energy services at the demand side, digital innovation, social learning and social diffusion processes, and so on. In the inner brown circle, you see the more proximate drivers of change which were shaping energy system trajectories, energy demand and energy supply. And again, I've talked about many of these: granularity, digitalization in our daily lives, usership captures this idea of kind of going from owning products to accessing services, particularly digitally, and so on. So this was our narrative, our story about the future. Next slide, please. And it's important, I think it's really important when doing scenario work to have a coherent story about what your future looks like, that you can then ensure your quantitative modeling assumptions are all consistent with. Next slide, please. So that's our drivers of change. We then translated that narrative into understanding quantitative changes in the energy services which make up the bulk of the energy system. So how we heat and cool our homes, how we get around, how we eat, because we're including land use in here, and then all the consumer goods which provide services from, you know, washing, hygiene, entertainment, socializing, and so on. We quantified the amount of these different energy services from 2020 to 2050, and also the energy and materials required to deliver them, both downstream or on the demand side, and upstream or on the supply side. Next slide, please. And when we crunched the numbers, we found that our scenario narrative translated into quantitative terms reduced global energy demand by around 40% to 2050. So that's this ruler image where you can see the LED, or low energy demand, horizontal line is way below where we are currently and way below what the other scenario literature for 1.5 degrees C target projects. Next slide, please. So that gave us our demand projections, and we could then look, using again an integrated assessment framework, we could look at the implications for the energy supply, land use, as well as climate outcomes. So this is using the Global Integrated Assessment Framework at an institute called EASA in Vienna. Next slide, please. And here's sort of one of many different kinds of outputs which we got from this modeling work. And this shows essentially the energy resources being harvested from nature each year that go into the global energy system. So what's called the primary energy resource. And you can see, if you look at the left-hand part of the slide, the historical substitution we've observed from traditional forms of energy, that's the green biomass, to the fossil fuels, that's the gray coal, the red oil, and the light blue gas. And then if you look at the sort of first of the shaded vertical strips, that's our scenario period, you see the rapid substitution of fossil fuels for the renewables. Now, crucially, what looks like an incredibly rapid discontinuous shift from fossil fuels to renewables actually has lower build rates than we're currently observing. So in this scenario, it's about 10 to 15% annual growth rates in solar and wind relative to 20% plus, which we're observing now. And the reason that that's possible is because the whole global energy system has shrunk to this lower level of energy demand. And that's shown by the bold numbers running along the top of the graph. In other words, classic sort of systems thinking, you start by scaling the size of the system appropriately to deliver necessary demand, and then you design and optimize how best to meet that demand through your supply. Next slide, please. So we also ran these numbers through a coupled climate model and showed that this scenario stayed within the 1.5 degrees C threshold, which is the ambition, obviously, of the Paris Agreement. And to boot, very strong co-benefits for other UN Sustainable Development Goals, like health. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, this sort of conventional wisdom, I think, in the global mitigation community. Next slide. And we were really pleased, actually, that our scenario, which was really the only one that focused on demand-side transformation, was included as one of the 4 marker scenarios in the IPCC's special report. So that's the one on the left, the P1. And critically, you can see there's no yellow wedge beneath the horizontal axis on the P1 scenario. So no negative emissions required if we act hard and fast, but with strong co-benefits on the demand side. Next slide, please. Okay, so that was a sort of, if you like, a kind of a rapid tour of some of the research I've been involved with over the past few years. And I wanted to end just by giving a little sense as the sort of research I'm involved with now and what I'm up to for the next few years. Next slide, please. So here are 3 topics that I'm really interested in. Digitalization as a general purpose technology, as a kind of a meta innovation, which is having transformative effects right throughout the economy and society. I'm interested in lifestyles and well-being, and probably like much of us, I'm interested in sort of post-pandemic futures and what they look like. Next slide, please. So just quickly, on digitalization, So I've got a project starting up later this year where I'll be looking at digitalization in a very sort of grounded domestic context and trying to understand the various factors which shape the connection between our use of digital technologies and services and the impacts on energy and material demands and so emissions. So there are different sort of mechanisms by which that can happen, which I've listed there. And for this project, we're going to be recruiting a whole bunch of living lab households to work with, doing sort of ethnographic and sociological work with them, but also collaborating with system modeling folk and material circular economy folk to understand the quantitative impacts on emissions. I've also been involved at the bottom on a couple of other things. So I work with Mission Innovation, which was launched alongside the Paris Climate Agreement, and it was focused on initially doubling energy investments in clean energy innovation. And I've been working a lot with those folk to try and make sure that energy demand side innovations maintain a profile up with the more conventional supply technologies. Next slide, please. So the second area that I've been working on a lot in the last year is thinking about lifestyles as an organizing concept which links together kind of behaviors and energy services in different domains. So, you know, we travel, we eat in a certain way, we own stuff, we do stuff at home. And lifestyles is an integrating construct across those different behaviors. So in this simple plot, I'm representing some empirical work we've done where we've looked at clusters of low carbon behaviors and also low carbon cognitions. So how we think, how we feel, and how we intend with respect to climate. There's obviously huge variability. So we've analyzed these clusters in national statistical data. And we're now building this into a simple lifestyle module, which can be coupled into a simulation model to look at the effects of lifestyle change over time. And this relates to the potential for lifestyle change to be one of these sort of positive tipping elements or positive tipping forces that the GSI is interested in. Next slide, please. And finally, work on post-pandemic futures. So this is a sketch of some scenario and pathways analysis that we've just had accepted for publication in Nature Energy, where we were looking at, we've obviously experienced this huge shock, and there's going to be some sort of recovery trajectory, the extent to which that recovery trajectory embeds, if you like, climate-friendly practices and behaviors and lifestyles within medium to longer term pathways will be hugely influential on longer term potentials to meet climate goals. I've also been doing some more sort of policy focused work, analyzing green recovery packages that are being announced in terms of their granularity. Remember the work I showed you at the beginning. So all of this sort of fits within some thinking around post-pandemic futures. Next slide, please. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say. I hope that sort of broad sketch was of interest to you. And yeah, I'm very happy to take questions. There's a few people sitting in the room with me, and I guess some people in Zoom. So perhaps, Jay, if you could go back to the Zoom window, maybe. Sorry, my colleague Jean-François.
Fantastic, Charlie. Thank you very much. I'm still remote, and I'll try and chair this. For those that are in the room with Charlie, I think the best thing to do might be if JF puts Charlie's virtual hand up, and then I'll know that one of you wants to ask a question, if that makes some kind of sense. So open for questions to Charlie now. If you switch on your video and put your actual hand up, you can do that, or I'll also watch the virtual hands if you know how to use the virtual hand up in the magic of Zoom. And if you want to write your question in the chat, I'll try and keep an eye on that as well. So there you go. Femke, you're first up.
That was really, really interesting. Thanks for that talk. I had a question about what do you think policy makers can do to use these social dynamics in designing better policy?
Yeah, I mean, there's a long tradition in some policy areas like agriculture of using these sort of opinion leadership, social network and social influence dynamics to spread innovations throughout communities of farmers, for example. And in fact, diffusion of innovations, the theory which we used in that work, really comes back from the 1940s and 50s from rural sociologists who are trying to understand the spread of agricultural innovations. And so the concept in land use of having agricultural extension agents, essentially you recruit opinion formers within communities who then sort of shape and pass on their experiences of innovations, is one which I think we've been relatively slow to pick up in the low carbon space. There are examples of it, for example, open homes, where you can go and see, for example, passive house systems or high energy efficiency buildings is a way of, using those social influence dynamics to spread knowledge and understanding. But you kind of specifically asked about policy. And I think the other work which I didn't show you, which poses an interesting policy challenge, is that if policy was to support very localized, spatially concentrated uptake of certain innovations, that would sit nicely with these neighborhood or peer effects and the broader awareness of those social norms, which would seed diffusion kind of from those local areas. So that would be a way of, geographically concentrating policy would be a way of harnessing those social influence dynamics. But it creates an interesting tension between more of a sort of thinking about equity and just transitions, and in the current UK discourse around levelling up. And so we've got work doing sort of regional analysis of some of this innovation uptake, where if you're focused on equity and just transition, you would look to spread your policy incentives and your policy effort widely. But if you're looking to harness these social influence dynamics, you'd be looking to concentrate them geographically. So that would be one sort of quite interesting example, I think, in answer to your question.
Fantastic. Ian, you've got your hand up next. Over to you.
Yeah, hi there. Let me just turn my video on. Thanks very much, Charlie. That was really interesting. I just wondered if you had any views about whether you think it matters who it is that it's adopting innovation. So there are clearly kind of social reasons for engaging, the most vulnerable households and so on. But do you think there are more pragmatic or practical reasons in terms of acceleration for engaging, large swathes of society rather than just following the kind of early adopter, most comfortable with risk parts of the population?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and it's in a way somewhat related to the point I was making just before, where I mean, you're absolutely right that the sort of classic, focus early adoption incentives on the technophiles and those more comfortable with the risks, who, tend to be younger, tend to be more educated, and tend to be wealthier. There's an inherently regressive aspect to those kinds of early adoption incentives, even if the longer term outcome, as the technological learning and the social learning proceeds, is that these innovations become more accessible to all. I mean, I know from your own work, I mean, in the domestic space, social housing is interestingly a relatively interesting sort of test bed for a lot of the more innovative low carbon technologies like ground source heat pump, as an example. So there are those sort of niches where I think it doesn't have the classic early adopters don't have to be the sort of, the young, educated, wealthy technophiles. In our own work, where we were looking at, so recall those different innovations I was showing you in the app icons. We looked at the profile of the early adopters right across the board, and we found, interestingly, that about a third had a sort of a classic environmental characteristic. So strong biospheric values, strong environmental lifestyles, and strong beliefs on climate change. About a third were the sort of classic technophiles, so the more classic early adopters. And then about a third were this interesting sort of, if you imagine the Venn diagram, they were the sort of intersection between the two of people who were both technophilic and biophilic, and very environmental. So I think and I think this is particularly the case with digital technologies, where you have communities of early adopters who are both the classic technophiles, with the element of regressiveness that you suggested in the question, but also the people minded towards environmental and climate change action. And I think that slightly dilutes the sort of inherent regressiveness of focusing on classic technophiles. But I do, yes, there is definitely a tension here between what you might think of as effectiveness, stimulating adoption and driving diffusion, and equity. And that's a tension that I think policymakers definitely face.
I might take Chair's privilege to follow up on this interesting theme from both the first couple of questions, Charlie. I've also, you know, slowly learned what you already know about how targeting particular smaller populations can get things going effectively. To sort of square that with the levelling up agenda and the just transformation, is it a viable strategy to, say, within the context of England, target a government effort on Cornwall, the poorest county? Or will that still not work because it might be the rich second homeowners in that county who turn out to be the first movers anyway? I mean, what I'm getting at is there still a way that can be just and can be effective by using the known dynamics of getting things going with smaller groups? So it's almost preferentially help those most in need, if you like, to start things.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. There is undoubtedly effectiveness benefits to, if you like, spatially concentrating innovation activity. And that can be, I mean, in the Cornish case, obviously, as we see, that can be to do with its endowment of natural resources, so in the renewable space. In other areas, like, for example, hydrogen and CCS clusters in South Wales or the Northeast, where you've got, obviously, industrial heritage. So there's clearly benefit to clustering innovation activity around centres with natural competencies, skills and capacities to make best use of them. But that wasn't quite what you asked. You asked, can you do that in a way which also addresses inequalities? And I mean, I don't think there's a neat answer to how you do that effectively in both. I have to admit, actually, in presenting this work over the last 6 months, like this question actually is the most common question I think that comes up about how you effectively balance that equity effectiveness trade-off. And we've seen undoubtedly with low carbon technologies, you know, PV from the last decade, and now we see it with electric vehicles, that the increasing availability of those technologies at an affordable, cost-effective rate to the mass market has come from incentives very much targeted in very concentrated doses in those markets where trying to address equity concerns was not the primary motivation. It was the classic sort of buying down the learning curve approach. And it's been extremely effective at getting these technologies more mass and commercially available. So whether you can couple that, addressing an equity dimension, I'm for capital intensive technologies, I'm less convinced that there's a neat answer.
Okay. Femke, back to you. And just a reminder, everybody else, if you can put your virtual hand up or put the screen on and the real hand up. Femke.
Yeah, I have a question about the geographical concentration. Do you know whether there's any evidence that that has decreased as a function of increased interaction via social media, which isn't geographically concentrated?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So the main spatial analysis we've done over the last couple of years is in a big project looking at local energy systems or smart local energy systems in the UK. And that goes back 10 years, which I guess would be long enough to capture what you've been describing. I haven't seen, I mean, this isn't just actually my research, this is sort of on the fringes of what I do. And I'm sure there's a lot of work that is looking at this. So I don't know if the substitution of word of mouth for digital word of mouth, electronic word of mouth, has had an effect on spatial clustering. I do know this isn't quite the answer to your question, but the survey work that I showed in my talk, where we asked people in late 2019 about their social networks. We also did a repeat survey of the same people in late 2020, and we asked about their social networks. So we asked about the size of their social networks, the diversity of their social networks, in terms of whether you talk to similar people or whether you talk to different people, and the frequency with which they interact with others. And unexpectedly, over that year, our social networks right across the board have shrunk. Like well over half respondents said they were interacting significantly less with both close social contacts and distant. Social media use, again, unsurprisingly, was up, but not up to the same extent that fully compensated for the downward impact on word of mouth. So the sort of diversity of information flows which we are experiencing, which are critical to innovation adoption, have gone down. Whether that has impacted spatial clustering of innovation adoption, I don't know, is the honest answer to your question. It's a good one.
So Charlie, Ian's question made me remember a local example because we started talking about heat pumps, air or ground. And what I picked up from people who know a lot more about this stuff in and around Exeter is what we have here is that there's a potential opportunity, as there would be in much of the country, for installing heat pumps, but we have a skills gap and a training gap. So like there's the Exeter College, which is the sixth form college basically next door pretty much to the uni, kind of gets this and might well respond to that. But it made me think of a broader issue. Is that something that sometimes happens, and is that something that you include in your modelling and analysis, that the logjam or the rate limiting step or the gap might be, in this case, we don't have enough people actually trained up to be confident in the technology to go and install it at someone's home, even though you could make a pretty good business out of doing that, all our evidence would suggest.
Yeah.
Tony might come in and correct me on this later because he knows these things locally better than I do, but that's my
So in the study I was mentioning of looking at the sort of spatial diffusion of these smart local energy systems, we did include skills implicitly as one of the independent variables by looking at sort of different measures of economic activity in various sort of technology, engineering and science sectors in local economies. So this was the spatial unit of analysis was the local authority area. And we found that levels of economic activity in sort of broadly energy engineering and tech sectors and digital sectors were significant predictors of adoption of these smart local energy systems. And you'll be pleased to hear, those in this room, that the presence of local universities with relevant technical expertise also help significantly predict adoption. In the case of heat pumps, I mean, obviously the smart local energy systems we're looking at in that analysis, there aren't that many of them in the UK, whereas heat pumps, there are over 50,000, I think, already and rising. And so that's actually, it makes me think that's a nice example of how you could potentially counter the regressive effects of just targeting incentives at early adopters on the demand side by boosting local capacity to deliver on that demand from, if you like, the supply side. These early adoption models which we use, they essentially kind of endogenize all of these external influences, whether it's policy incentives, available installers, and so on, through the lens of the perceptions of the adopter. So in other words, I could tell you what I see the relative advantage of a heat pump is to me, and that would in turn be shaped by the competencies of my local supply chain. So they would ultimately feed through into individual adoption. But yeah, that would be a nice, and I think a nice example of a sort of a more equity-based approach.
Great. I'm not seeing any more virtual hands up or people waving at me. Jay,
Well,
I think you're in the room with Charlie. Do you wonder, have you got any questions in the room there? I'll come to you.
Oh, sorry, yes, Jean-Francois was politely raising his hand.
Yeah, you were meant to raise your digital hand, Captain, because I can't.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
He's the only one who can't raise his hand.
Yeah, you might have to come over and talk into a microphone.
Digital hand, you see, but over to you, Jay.
Right, so Charlie, my question is, so going back to your LED scenario of Buildr et al. In Nature Energy, I think it was, how normative do you think is that scenario? I mean, it's these scenarios, you never know whether people think this is what we should be doing, or this is what's going to happen, or this is plausible, or this is aspirational. And I say that because there's, you described a number of possible reductions in energy that are feasible because of digitalization. Ultimately, all this energy not used, this is cost saving for a lot of people and companies. And in fact, it's an enormous productivity gain for a lot of companies down the line, because this is all money that could be spent on other things that is not spent on energy.
Yeah.
And the more I think of it, the more I'm convincing myself that actually this is possibly where the economy would be going anyway, just because companies will be willing. I mean, I'm thinking of what we're doing today right now, right? So I'm thinking of, we're meeting remotely, well, semi-remotely, so I'm there in person, and we've got this amazing technological room here, and there's these screens everywhere, and we're kind of talking, and that's all people who didn't have to travel here, so all this special not used, and that's a new kind of business model as well. Yeah. So I'm thinking more and more that the LED scenario is actually quite realistic.
Yes, so okay, in answer to the first bit of your question about the normativity, I mean, it's very definitely a scenario which describes what could happen, and we think all the assumptions that went into it are realistic and grounded on evidence that we could find. We're definitely not saying, well, we're definitely not saying we think it should happen, but we are saying if this happens, there would be significant benefits for a whole range of sustainable development goals, not just climate. In other words, it's for us a very appealing world in which to aim for, and that was kind of the aim of the work. There was a related aim of the work, which was making the argument that reducing greenhouse gas emissions to 1.5, the target, is not just about climate policy. I think there's a tendency in the modelling and scenario world to see climate policy as the sort of singular lever by which we achieve these desirable end states. And we put a lot of emphasis on innovation around services, energy services, business models for delivering those services, and why they are appealing in and of themselves. So you mentioned cost savings on, if you like, the sort of more business side, the firm side. But we think there are huge benefits for example, livable cities, which would be experienced on the demand side. There are some remarkable studies by the International Transport Forum, which is a sort of sister organization to the OECD. I mean, not a kind of radical firebrand think tank. You know, this is part of the OECD setup. And they show that shared mobility platforms delivering urban mobility can provide the same amount of passenger kilometers moving people around cities for a tiny fraction of the vehicle fleet, which then frees up enormous amounts of road infrastructure for other, you know, let's say more enjoyable, more useful purposes. So, you know, really interesting transformative visions for what cities might look like under these low energy demands scenarios. So yes, I would agree with you. I think there are lots and lots of appealing dimensions to demand side transformation. The counter question we would always get would be, well, okay, if all of these services become super appealing, then people are going to consume much more of them, and there's going to be a rebound, and there's going to be, as a result, more energy demand. But we actually ran some quite strict sensitivities to see, so our scenario could tolerate a doubling of energy service consumption as a result of rebound effects, and still stay within that 1.5 degrees C limit. And ultimately, rebound is a problem that can be managed through policy as well. So yes, I would broadly agree that the scenario, although not normative, certainly characterizes a desirable state, a desirable future state. Yes.
Right. I have discovered one more question in the chat, and this will need to be the last one. It might need a short answer, but it's a good one from AR, and I don't know which AR that is, but can you distinguish between the effects of social trends and government policies? Some governments appear to lead while others are dragged by perceived popular demand. Are there areas of innovation that are more susceptible to bottom-up rather than top-down influence?
Yeah, great question. I mean, the sorts of innovations that I focused my own research on have been these consumer innovations, which, I mean, have tended to be areas in which policy has not been as directly involved in directing and steering. I think there's a bigger sort of policy fingerprint, if you like, on the energy supply side than there is on the demand side, where, rightly or wrongly, social influence dynamics and social trends are perceived to be the kind of more influential shapers of what's been going on. So that's a very short answer to the question.
But great, thank you, Charlie. Well, we're up to the hour. On a hot day, but well done, audience, for engaging. Thank you so much for the inspiring talk, Charlie. Let's give Charlie one more round of virtual applause. Oh, you can find the magic button, and yeah, wish everybody a low energy consumption summer before we see you again for the kickoff of next academic year's GSI seminars, which I'm sure will be sometime in September, I guess. So enjoy the unseasonably warm weather in the meantime, folks.